Before we begin the basics of retouching, we actually want to make sure we understand how to use adjustment layers and actually make any tonal corrections. So we have started with, we've got a before layer, we've got a retouching layer, which is where we're going to end up retouching. And then we also have the ability to add adjustment layers. So I actually have my Photoshop set up so that my layers are in this panel and adjustments are right here. I've actually customized my layers and adjustments to be close to one another so it's easy for demonstration purposes, and really I use them in combination with one another quite often. So in this case what happens is if I want to create any types of adjustments, as you hover over these it does tell you what type of adjustment it is. So for instance, brightness and contrast is exactly what it sounds like. It'll brighten or add some contrast to your photo. Levels will help you change tonal corrections. Curves is very similar to levels, but just a different version. There's exposure, which we won't really get too far into today at all. Vibrance, hue and saturation, color balance, black and white, and that'll actually convert your layer to black and white. Or your photo. It's not officially a grayscale photo, but it will give you the appearance of a black and white photo. We have photo filter, channel mixer, color lookup, invert, posterize, threshold, selective color, and gradient map. So again, you're not necessarily going to use all of these adjustment layers, but it's important to know as you start to apply these various things to photos that you do not want them necessarily to be permanent changes. You want the ability to come back and change your mind and edit things as you go. So the one that we're going to get into first is levels. I'm just going to click it. What happens is, let's just show you our layers real quick. It adds this layer here, okay? And this layer basically now has levels. So this little histogram that's showing up on our layer, anytime you want to come back and edit, you can literally double click that. Or, you know, when it first pops up, you can edit it. So you did see that option for it to give us to edit. Just know that anytime you create an adjustment layer, it does physically create a new layer that gives you all the typical layer abilities to hide, show, and lock layers. So we do have options here, and again, levels is usually used first, unless you prefer curves, to help you understand how to change these tonal values in your photo. So this histogram basically shows us like the light and dark values in this photo. So this little triangle here, this gray one, and this white one represent the shadows, the midtones, and the highlights in our photo. So as we start to see these peaks and curves in our histogram, that basically is giving us some hints to color data that's there. A good rule of thumb, but not always exact, is that you can drag this triangle towards that line to bring a little bit more of whatever value you're trying to change. So in this case it's the shadows. And so if you do want to be able to bring in more values, that does help you, and in some cases the highlights might as well. I actually find that this photo has a lot of highlights, especially in the face area, just not in the background, so I don't think we need to change that too much. The midtones really are key here, and this is because a lot of photos do end up with gray values. So you do have the ability to lighten them or darken them. So if you do have a photo that's either washed out or not, you can either bring back a little bit of those mid-tone values, or you can make them kind of tone down just a little bit, and that might help you before you actually get it a little bit further into your retouching. So we do want these tonal values to be exact. The important thing about this is, as we zoom into our images, we are going to be able to see a lot of detail. And so as we're actually looking at these layers, when I come back here, if I hide it and show it, it's basically helping me see, in some cases, more pixels, but in other cases, some adjustment layers, you may actually end up not having as much to retouch. For example, when you use a black and white adjustment layer, when there is like a highlighter on a photo, sometimes that actually helps eliminate that. So it is going to be very important to actually do these adjustment layers first. We won't necessarily get into a demonstration about every single one of them, but for instance, brightness and contrast is one that you might use, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It'll either brighten or darken the values. And you can type in a number here to get back to that 0 value. Contrast sometimes will help add a little bit of contrast, so almost like a little bit of clarity to your photo. Sometimes it works nicely, sometimes it doesn't. I'm just going to exaggerate this a little bit so you can see. And that's what's really nice about adjustment layers is you can go in and have fun, and you can actually try a few different versions, and you can say, well, yeah, that looks a little bit better, or no, it doesn't. And you can either turn it on or turn it off. And at any point you can delete these. You do want to make sure adjustment layers are above the work that you're doing, because they are going to impact all of the layers beneath. So if you ever want it to just impact one layer, there are ways by holding Option to basically connect it to just one layer. Usually for this first project we don't need to do that, but just know that there are ways to be able to selectively make sure that an adjustment layer only affects one layer versus every layer. So by default it is going to affect every layer that you've got, and in this case for the retouching project that is pretty common. Another one that is very helpful is curves, and I don't really want to get in too much detail with this because it is a lot like levels. So let me just turn off my levels real quick, and it is, there we go, it's off. And so we will just go and double click right here. It brings my curves back, and you see that histogram again. So basically you get to do almost like a math game here and drag arcs, and you can actually click and pull points, and you can change values. I personally prefer levels over curves because I find that this is a little bit harder for me to control. However, you guys might end up following some sort of tutorial, or you might end up liking curves better. So I did want to make sure that you are aware that they're there, and they are very similar to levels. You just have to choose which one that you like. But again, it does feel like it's working with math curves and stuff, so I'm not as much of a fan of this. So we do have, let's see, adjustment layers. The black and white adjustment layer is helpful. So this photo actually is, if we look at it, black and white, and we can click on the black and white adjustment layer, and you guys should notice that the colors did just change. So I usually do not edit any of these colors in my black and white adjustment layers. A lot of the times when I'm editing photos in more detail for black and white, I actually use Lightroom because it offers me a lot more easy changes for black and white that I prefer. So usually this is just a quick adjustment layer, and you can see it kind of wipes out that color tint that's happening when we bring in different things. Again, keep in mind this adjustment layer, it might be helpful for you to have it black and white, but that does not change this to grayscale. So when you do have a project requirement where you have to change the color mode to either grayscale or CMYK, you do want to make sure that you still go in and change those color modes for yourself. Okay, there are some other options here. Let's just see, let me turn that black and white one off, and I'll turn curves off. We'll bring our levels back. We have hue and saturation, which we'll just touch on quickly. You may end up using this a little bit more when we get to colorization, but basically it allows you to control like the hue of the photo, which again, this photo doesn't have a lot of color in it, so you're not going to see a lot of color changes. Saturation is basically going to take all the color away, which again is another way to make it black and white, or it's going to oversaturate the photo, which obviously that makes it look really terrible. So you usually do not want to push it that far. And then we have the lightness, which I can't say I alter that too much, but it's essentially like lightening or darkening a photo. So usually the hue or the saturation might be things that we might want to change. When you do have the option here to change hue and saturation for the saturation stuff, like right here we do have the ability to target certain colors as well. So just keep that in mind as you start to edit and change things. That is very helpful. So at any point we can come in and decide we do or do not want these adjustment layers. So they are not a permanent change to your file. They are literally an option for you to have that allows you to go back to your original file without having to worry about losing any type of work. When you delete these files, though, you will notice, do you want to delete the file mask? If you just press delete, that actually, it's almost like having to delete things twice. So you may find carrying things to the trash can a little bit easier than pressing delete. And then you can just basically go through and make those judgment calls before we actually start retouching. So again, those usually are going to stay at the very top so that we know that they are going to affect all these layers beneath it, and we will start learning retouching next.